Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? Recently, Nintendo filed a lawsuit against a couple of websites for offering free downloads of ROM files of its older games. As you'd imagine, the gaming community has gotten a bit worked up over this. So this time, let's cut through some of the hysteria and figure out what's really going on. Alright, so in the middle of July 2018, Nintendo filed a US federal lawsuit against a guy named Jacob Matthias and his company Matthias Designs. Now, he owns the sites Love ROMs and Love Retro, both of which hosted Nintendo game ROM files for free download, amongst some other material. Shortly after that lawsuit was filed, both sites went offline. Probably not that surprising. What is surprising is that Nintendo actually filed a lawsuit. This is a relatively new thing when it comes to Nintendo and ROMs online. Typically, what we've seen from them are cease and desist letters. Sometimes against sites that host ROMs, but maybe more visibly, we've seen them against those offering ROM hacks. ROM hackers used to generally release the full hacked ROM file. Just download this thing, dump it on a flash cart, play it in an emulator, and you're good. But largely, a lot of them have started going to just releasing the patch file for their work. And it's up to you to take that patch file and use an application on your computer to apply it against the original ROM, which they leave up to you to acquire on your own. Super Mario Land 2 DX and Pokemon Prism, both for the Game Boy Color, those are really good examples of this. Now, cease and desist letters are basically just warnings drafted by lawyers, and they're meant to intimidate. They're not really a legal process thing. Anybody can send a cease and desist to anybody else for doing something that they just don't want. And oftentimes, those cease and desist letters are without merit. So it's really just used as kind of a way to coerce people into doing something or stop doing something using scary language and the threat of legal action. So because of, I would say, maybe their overuse, it's kind of gotten to the point where a lot of people tend to take them with a grain of salt, right? Maybe they'll take them kind of seriously, but at the same time, nothing has really happened. You're not really that much in trouble. So cease and desist, yeah, okay, whatever. Maybe it's a big deal, maybe it's not. But an actual lawsuit, that means business. So what's going on this time? Well, this is where the internet hype machine kind of kicks in. Some gamers are vilifying Nintendo over this, claiming that it's trying to kill off game preservation and free access to these games and history and all that stuff. And I'll agree, there has indeed been a bit of a chilling effect that's come from this lawsuit. So not only have Love ROMs and Love Retro shut down because they were the targets of that lawsuit, but another website, Emulators, has decided to pull its Nintendo ROMs even though it wasn't named in the suit. That site basically kind of saw the writing on the wall and realized, even though they haven't been directly targeted yet, it's quite likely that because Nintendo has taken this next step to really start going after the ROM hosting sites, they were probably next. So some people claim it's an attack on emulation, and that Nintendo is trying to kill off emulation as a whole, that kind of software, developments, activity like that. And yeah, indeed, Nintendo's own lawsuit, if you read through it, it specifically calls out the fact that those two sites offered, here's the quote, the proprietary BIOS software for several of Nintendo's video game systems. And here's the thing though, emulation is completely legal because of established legal precedent, and Nintendo can't change that. It all stems back to a court case in the US called Sony versus Connectax. In 1999, there was kind of a parallel case where Sony went after Bleem, filed like right after that Connectax lawsuit. They both basically had the same thing going on. Connectax and later Bleem wrote a PlayStation emulator for the Mac and the PC. Sony obviously wanted to sell physical PlayStation consoles to make money. And because Connectax and later Bleem were writing software that could play PlayStation games on hardware you already had, your own computer, and that software was priced less than a physical PlayStation console, that could potentially cost Sony sales. So, as you'd imagine, Sony kind of freaked out, took them to court. Well, as that case made its way through court, it was found that the emulator Connectax wrote had been completely reverse engineered, like from the PlayStation on its own. Connectax didn't just steal code from the PlayStation BIOS or reuse anything that Sony had made or written. The company basically took PlayStation games and some PlayStation hardware and just on its own figured out how they worked. And then it set out to write software from scratch to play those games. Because Connectax and Bleem didn't use any of Sony's copyrighted code or proprietary, information, anything like that, the court actually found that the emulators were completely legal. They hadn't really infringed on any of Sony's rights. Yeah, too bad, so sad that Sony may lose some PlayStation sales because of the emulators, but on its face, emulators, those two, were completely legal. And so that's what really set the precedent, at least in the US, to say that emulation, just on its face as a whole, is completely legal, provided you're doing it correctly. Now, what that call out in Nintendo's lawsuit about offering the proprietary BIOS software of the game systems, that's like the actual code running on the hardware to initialize it and be able to play the games and stuff like that. Where that comes into play is some emulators don't work like completely on their own, but rather they're kind of like a shell that requires a copy of that BIOS code in order to function. It's kind of like, I don't want to really call it a cheat, but it's like a quicker way to get an emulator put together or to have one emulator system be able to handle multiple consoles without having to like rewrite a whole bunch of stuff over and over. The BIOS, though, is proprietary and copyrighted, so it's not legal to do that. It's not legal to have people go out, need to get like a copy of work basically that Nintendo did in order to make their emulator work, regardless of whether they're selling that emulator or offering it for free. Whether you're selling something or offering it for free, when it comes to this kind of case, is really pretty much irrelevant. If you get found guilty of it, the damages can be different in some cases, depending on if you profited or not, but in either case, that's really not that big of a factor. So that's really kind of what the heart of this lawsuit is about. Is it's not emulation on its face. It's not about like the historical aspect of these games or, getting rid of like game preservation, anything like that. What the lawsuit is really about is just simple copyright. Some might argue that these games are abandonware, right? Especially if they aren't available for sale in their original form, like you can't go out and buy a brand new cartridge copy of an NES title, or those games aren't available through another platform like the eShop. Maybe it's a game that was a little more obscure, only came out originally on cartridge and that's it. Never became available in any other format. Some might claim that to be abandonware. But the thing is, because something seems like it's abandonware doesn't mean it reverts to the public domain. Abandonware is actually this really nebulous concept that doesn't have like an official legal status. Titles that you may consider to be under abandonware are still under copyright and its copyright holder is well within its rights to still control distribution unless they have expressly put that work, whatever it is, in the public domain. So yeah, some pieces of abandonware are like safe in quotation marks because their creators have basically said they're not interested in them anymore. They made their money way back when that product was new. They figure the interest in it these days is relatively low. It's not worth their time to continue to sell it or update it or support it. Or maybe they've just moved on in their lives. Maybe it was an indie developer or just a single author, like for shareware. They don't really want to deal with it anymore. Here, you can have it for free. In some cases, abandonware is kind of like safe in that regard. And in other cases, you know, it could be kind of considered safe because like maybe the original company that wrote that software went out of business and its assets weren't purchased by anyone. Effectively, the company just closed and kind of went poof. And there's really nobody left who cares about that software anymore. Those are in some ways considered safe in quotation marks in that you're likely not going to have a problem if you get a copy of that and want to distribute it. But clearly this is not the case with Nintendo or its games, who can and still does sell those games, and they do have a real market value, right? Especially the more popular titles, which Nintendo can demonstrate has a value because they are selling them on places like the eShop and people are buying them. So from a legal standpoint, Nintendo is indeed in the right here to be going after the ROM sites, filing lawsuits, because they are engaging in copyright infringement. You know, on its face, they basically are stealing from Nintendo. Nintendo could be selling that content and profiting off of it, but the ROM sites are cutting them out of that profit. Now, why the gaming community is freaked out about all of this, and frankly kind of pissed off, is I think multifaceted. And some people fall into kind of one category or another. For some, it's just the simple fact that it's going to be harder to get those ROMs, right? Some of the sites that have been targeted or are proactively taking stuff down are the bigger name sites on the web. They made it easy to find those ROM files, download them, get information about them, that sort of thing. So now if you want a copy of those ROMs, you have to do extra work to try and find one, because remember, piracy is never 100% going to go away. Those ROM files are never 100% going to go away. No matter how hard Nintendo tries, you'll always be able to download those ROM files off the internet. But some people are pissed off just because now it's going to be harder to get at them. Deeper into that argument, I think a lot of that attitude, being pissed off because it's harder to get at them now, is because the internet has, over the years, really led us to believe that we're entitled to just free stuff. And because the prevalence of piracy is just so widespread, we kind of have this expectation, right? That anything we may want that could be distributed through the internet, we should be able to find for free with some amount of work. And so, you know, I guess you could say it's maybe it's like a spoiled brat kind of syndrome, like, oh, I want my ROM files and I want them easy to get and I want them now. Well, I think some people are like that. Probably not most gamers are like that, thankfully. I like to think that most gamers are a little more level-headed than that, but maybe subconsciously this is kind of one of the things that's got people pissed off, is now it's just going to be, oh man, it's a little bit harder to find copies of these ROMs. Now, the other argument that I've seen is one about game preservation, right? That by taking these sites down, it's going to be harder to get copies of these games. Fewer people are going to be exposed to them. It may put some of the less common or more obscure games at risk of being forgotten about or lost. And, you know, I actually think in some ways those arguments are valid, but at the same time, I feel like there's maybe a sprinkling of paranoia in there. A lot of these original games were produced in mass quantities, right? It's not like a particularly obscure title only had like 10 copies manufactured an original cartridge for them, and then that was it, and those are the only 10 copies that are available. I mean, like Nintendo World Championships, kind of like carts, those super rare ones, yeah, you could say that, but those weren't meant for mass distribution. Like any of the like production game titles that were meant to be sold at retail and were sold at retail, I mean, they had a decent number of copies made because they all wanted to sell those games in earnest. So, they're going to try and make copies available for people to buy. So to claim that, something like Super Mario 2 is going to get lost to time without free ROM download sites, well, I think that's a bit of a stretch, right? And that's because a lot of those games, yeah, they are still widely available and prices are going to fluctuate and all that, but to say they're going to be lost to time, maybe because those physical cartridges start disappearing, people accidentally throw them out, or they just start failing or whatever, I don't think it's fair to tie game preservation, like the threat of loss of game preservation, I should say, against those original physical copies, because it's still totally legal for you to go and make ROM dumps of stuff you own. And that's kind of the flip side to the whole copyright infringement argument that Nintendo has going against these sites. Yeah, it's illegal for you to go and infringe somebody else's copyright and distribute it for free without their permission. But at the same time, there are fair use kind of like angles to copyright law that do apply towards people preserving copies of stuff themselves. So if you've got a less common game title, you don't really have to worry so much about like the cartridge itself failing and never being able to play it again, simply because you are still within your rights, at least in the US, and copyright law varies around the world. But at least from my perspective, what I know in the US, you're still within your rights to make a backup copy of that cartridge to a ROM file. That falls under fair use, as long as you don't just start turning around and giving it away for free. There may be a little bit of an argument about DMCA violation if you're getting into newer games that use encryption, because the DMCA prevents people from breaking encryption on copyrighted media in order to distribute it and stuff. There have been exceptions to the DMCA regarding encryption as well, and they change periodically. They go up for review every once in a while. But for the most part, for the context of what we're talking about here, things like NES, Super NES ROMs, the older stuff, that's not encrypted, fair use. You can dump your own copies and pretty much be confident knowing that as long as you keep those copies to yourself, you're safe. So, to say that by taking down these ROM sites, it's going to threaten the history of these games and digital preservation efforts and all that, well, I would say it's neither here nor there. There are always other workarounds to allow people to be able to experience these games. Now, I'm not trying to give Nintendo a pass here, right? On its face, I do strictly believe that, yes, Nintendo is within its rights to be going after ROM sites offering these files for free downloads. But I think the real thing that's gotten people frustrated and worked up about it is because it's kind of like Nintendo is adding insult to injury with this one. A lot of people have been frustrated, myself included, with Nintendo and its handling of older titles in places like the eShop, making them available for purchase. Even things like the NES and Super NES Classic and the limited quantities at which those consoles were being made and sold, even on their second run, it's still not super easy to get one of those consoles, and not everything is available in the eShop. Only select numbers of games from various systems are out there, and not even all of the older systems have games available in the eShop. Plus, some people think, and I tend to agree, that the prices are too high for what's available in the eShop for those retro titles on the Virtual Console, considering the age and ubiquity of those titles. Mario 3 is everywhere. It's been issued for a whole bunch of platforms over the years. Do you really still need to keep charging the same amount of money for that game, even though it's just all over the place? And to top it all off, those purchases, when you do make them from Nintendo, they're not transferable between platforms. So if you like buy it on the Wii U, you can't then transfer that purchase to a 3DS, and you can't transfer it to a Switch. Nintendo makes you repurchase that game over and over and over again. So, you've got that kind of coupling of how Nintendo is handling it, plus the fact that some physical copies of the games that aren't available, through the eShop, they're becoming highly sought after, and the prices on them, I would say, are maybe artificially high. So you've got this additional angle of there being the lack of an affordable and convenient option for legally getting a copy of some of these older games. And it's going to drive people to piracy. So it's understandable why those sites exist. I mean, yeah, for some people, it's just because they want to play Mario 3 on an emulator on their PC and not have to go out and buy a retro console and whatever to do it. But for some other people, it's because ROM file downloads, illegal ones, are kind of like the only option that they practically have in order to experience some of these older titles due to inaction on Nintendo's part. So it's frustrating, especially when you consider it compared to other really slow moving industries like the media industry. I mean, the media industry has even figured out this problem. They've got a solution for it. The movie and music and TV categories, the amount of piracy amongst those is in the decline simply because the media industry has fostered and finally embraced all of these other convenient and affordable legal alternatives to getting that media in the hands of people. Platforms like Spotify and Netflix and Hulu, where it's a reasonable price and a large quantity of content, and it's right there available for you to access. It's not really worth the trouble in a lot of cases now to pirate media when legally accessing it is so cheap and so convenient. So what's the deal with Nintendo? Why have they not figured it out too? The video game industry has generally been one that's been moved quite a bit faster than the media industry in terms of technological progress and all that. I mean, Sony's got game streaming figured out. Xbox, they've been pushing things forward in terms of technology as well. Why hasn't Nintendo come up with a platform that allows a broad assortment of these retro titles that are available for quick and easy access for a reasonable amount of money? Something like maybe $40 a year. And you can play all of the retro games you want from their catalog, maybe NES, Super NES, Game Boy, maybe N64 if they can get that emulation to work really well. For a flat rate every year, you can just play everything in that catalog on any console you sign into, and it works on multiple kinds of consoles. You can play it on your Switch, you can play it on your 3DS, you can play it on whatever comes after the Switch, just for one, easy annual fee. I think a solution like that is really what a lot of gamers are looking for, and if that were in place and it offered a really good, deep catalog of titles, I don't think people would be quite so worked up about this whole Nintendo lawsuit thing. Why Nintendo hasn't figured that out yet, why they're clinging to this legacy approach and doing a half-assed job at making those older games available, I think that's a really good question that nobody really knows the answer to. But anyway, I am curious as to your thoughts. What's your take on this whole thing? Do you think Nintendo should back off on this one? Do you think Nintendo should continue its pursuit of this? Do you agree with me that if there were a convenient, more affordable, complete option for getting at these games, that it wouldn't be really as big of a deal? Or would it still be a big deal? Or is the concept of free ROM downloads of these older titles Is there something else there that I'm missing that makes them really important from like a historical preservation perspective or something like that? Just let me know down in the comments what you think. Also, if you're interested in audio-only versions of these podcasts, I have them available as plain MP3 downloads for supporters of my Patreon page at all contribution levels. It's as little as $1 a month. You get a private RSS feed. You can throw it into the podcast player of your choice. Plus, these usually go up a few days before they show up on YouTube, and it all goes to help support the channel. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, yeah, maybe you want to go check that out. Anyway, if you like this one, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.